Hey everyone, it's Colin. One of the first things that can wear out really with any game system is going to be the controllers themselves. They're simply what experience the most use and in some cases abuse. Third-party controllers have existed really ever since the first game systems came out to either give you special options in terms of like turbo or rapid fire kind of features, or to serve as a less expensive version of the first-party controllers. With the modern resurgence in retro gaming, something interesting is that third-party controllers are starting to show up on the market again for those vintage systems. And today I just wanted to take a minute to take a look at this. It's the TTX Tech Classic Controller for Super NES. So the Classic Controller comes in two versions, either this original Super Famicom style or the more traditional purple button North American Super NES style. And straight out of the box, the controller does appear to be a pretty good replica. One thing to note, however, is that there's absolutely no branding on it whatsoever. They wouldn't be able to get away with that. And something also is that this sticker seems to be a little rotated. Look at the angle of the XYAB compared to the orientation of the controller. That's not something that you see with an original Super NES controller. The letters are parallel with the face of the controller. Another thing to note is that there's absolutely no screen printing of any kind on the face of this controller. Not only is there no logo of any kind, but the select and start is actually embossed into the plastic of the controller, whereas it's screen printed on the front to make it easier to read. If you don't have the orientation of these two buttons memorized, you may be getting a little close and trying to squint to try and read where it actually says select and start, since the embossed letters don't stand out very well. Compared to the original, the buttons actually don't feel bad at all. I'm kind of surprised. I figured they'd be mushy and really non-responsive, but they've got a nice positive tactile feel to them. The D-pad also very nice and I wouldn't say clicky, but tactile. And what I think is an improvement of the original, the faces of these select and start buttons are flat. They're not rounded, so they seem to be a little bit easier to grip and press with your thumb. The shoulder buttons work decently enough, and they've got the same level of kind of clickiness as the face buttons have, but they are a bit stiff. You really got to put some force into pressing these shoulder buttons, whereas the shoulder buttons on original NES controller are a little bit easier to depress. The cable length between the two seems to be about the same, but I will note that the cable quality on this aftermarket controller isn't as good. The cable itself isn't quite as pliable, so it's going to want to retain the memory of when it was all wrapped up here. And it's also a bit thinner. It just doesn't feel quite as substantial as the cable from the original controller. Something that's very common to go bad on original controllers like this is the cable itself. You oftentimes will get nicks, kinks, or shorts in the actual lead, either through normal use or maybe you have a pet that finds this particular material tasty. This controller, I've got a couple of spots where the insulation has been damaged on this cable. One way that I would normally get around that is to carefully disassemble the controller and slide some heat shrink tubing over these sections. But with the Super NES, it's a little bit difficult to get everything taken apart in such a way that you can slide an appropriate size piece of heat shrink over this cable. One thing I'm curious about is whether I can use the cable off of this clone controller to work as a replacement. Only one way to find out. As Dave Jones says, don't turn it on, take it apart. It's interesting how similar these two look on the inside though. You can tell that TTX Tech was very careful in trying to mimic the overall construction of the original controller when making their replica. One bummer is that you cannot use, easily at least, the cable off of this replica controller as a replacement for that of an original Super NES controller, and as you can probably tell, the reason is the Super NES controller has a nice connector where the cable goes to the board, whereas on the replica controller it's simply soldered down. That doesn't make it impossible. You could simply solder the new cable to the old board if you really wanted to, but I was hoping for a real plug-and-play solution. There's a few other differences inside this controller too. For example, look at the shoulder buttons and specifically their hinges. The hinge pins are built into the shoulder button paddle itself. whereas the hinge pin on the original controller is made of metal and is separate from the shoulder button. This, I think, adds a little bit of reliability to the original controller because as you're mashing on that shoulder button, you're not wearing out a piece of plastic. You've got a nice piece of metal in there. So this controller looks and works well enough, but what about its feel? Well, aside from the fairly clicky buttons, overall it does feel fairly cheap. It's obviously engineered down to a price point. Now, is that necessarily a problem for this controller? I don't really think so, and here's the reason why. These are incredibly inexpensive. I was able to pick this one up for $5 from a local independent video game store, and I have no doubt that you can find them for a similar price, if not less, online. So ultimately the question is this controller worth it? And I actually would say yes. For the $5 that I spent, I really wasn't expecting a whole lot more, and I'm pleasantly surprised with the decent feel of the buttons and D-pad on this controller. Yeah, the housing itself feels cheap and it's a little chintzy. You can tell it's not an original controller. But again, $5. It's really tough to argue with this as a decent spare or backup controller to maybe preserve your originals so they don't wear out so quickly. Anyway, if you liked the video, thumbs up if you please, subscribe if you haven't already, and as always, thank you all so much for watching.